Everybody, thanks for coming to our latest book talk. I'm really pleased to have with us, on behalf of all of AFSA, Ron Cass, who's had an amazing foreign service and military career, and he's going to tell us all about it. I love the title of his book, Seriously Not All Right, It's How I Feel Some Days. But as someone who's also served in some of these places, but you know, Ron has had a career, first in the military, but then a 14-year career in the foreign service that included connecting all the dots of the war zones. He's been in Kosovo. He has served in Afghanistan, first for the military, then for the foreign service after 9/11. He was called up in the military. Then he circled back and went to Darfur, where he spent 2 years, and has also, among other places, done TDYs in lovely Camp Ashraf, Iraq. And so it's an amazing career, and I look forward to his reminiscence and also the kind of impact that has on him and on all of us who have served in those places and who work in the foreign service. So this, just to remind folks, is part of our regular book talks that we have, and includes a range. We've had Ambassador Larry Pope here, we've had Ambassador John Addleton. In the recent past, we had Marvin Kalb, and many others. And so stay tuned as we find other members of the Foreign Service and others in the foreign affairs business who give us a talk. And we also are going to be selling copies of Ron's book for $25 after the talk. So welcome, Ron. Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to do my best to hold on to this and not sort of set it down and go wandering off somewhere, which is my want. We're using this because of the camera. Not because I can't speak loud enough to do this.
Say what?
I can do that. Welcome, and thank you all for coming. It means a great deal to me. It really does, to have people come to these events. I thought what I would do would be talk a bit and read a bit and then answer questions. Because inevitably, I will say something and I'll see someone in the crowd give that RCA dog thing to go. And I think, okay, there's going to be a question about that. So I'm always happy to take questions towards the end. The basic outline of the story is this. I joined the Army in 1983. Spent a couple years as an enlisted soldier, then was commissioned into the regular Army. Spent about 9 years on active duty. And then joined the Foreign Service. Stayed in the reserve. Joined the Foreign Service in 1994. I was in the first A100 class to start at the new FSI. So that tells you, you can place it into the continuum there. Spent the next, not quite 15 years in the Foreign Service, but going back and forth between Foreign Service and the Army, where I spent so many years before. Because sort of right in the middle of that, the attacks on the United States of September 11th happened. And as anyone that was in the reserve or the military at that time was called, and you went. When the Secretary of State was Colin Powell, nobody who was a reservist that got called was going to stay at the department. You were going back to the reserve. And the couple of people who actually tried learned very quickly that that's not what he wanted. The rumor was that there was an assistant secretary who wanted to fight for one of her people to stay or his people to stay. I actually don't know the gender. And got the phone call, the secretary would like to see. So what I thought I'd do was start about 15 years ago. I was in Kosovo. And we had been sent to Kosovo as part of a diplomatic observer mission. There were 3 teams: the United States team, the European Union team, and a Russian Federation team. The US team was made up of 12 people, 6 Foreign Service officers and 6 military officers. And we were sent there to serve as observers. But the implied task was stop the fighting. And if you followed Kosovo in 1998, you'll know we were miserably unable to do that. We had 2 sides that were both uninterested in peace. Both thought they could have a military solution. if you read war novels, if you read books about war experience, going back to the Iliad, one common scene in every war novel is the protagonist's first encounter with dead, war dead. And I have one of those in my memoir. This is not a novel, it's a memoir. It's what happened to me. But this is my first experience with war dead. It happened in Kosovo in September of 1998. I'd been there for about 2 months. Yellow. Their skin was yellow. They had dirt under their fingernails and their feet were dirty. There were 6 of them, all women, under the tarpaulin. Some of them had lived long enough to have their wounds bandaged before they died. Some of them were killed more or less instantly as shrapnel or 7.62 millimeter rounds had entered their bodies. They'd been dead for about 24 hours. We knew this because we had come to witness their funeral, to witness and to stand a type of guard. For if we were present, the Serb snipers would not shoot at the family members as they buried their dead. It was the first time I'd ever seen war dead. I remember being surprised that their skin was yellow. My experiences with death before that day had been limited to a few funerals, a friend's older brother, my grandmother. It was the first time I'd ever seen what dead people looked like if no embalming was done, what they looked like without makeup and a nice suit of clothes. They were just dead. Lying in a tangle of limbs under a blue UN tarp, on a trailer that only a week before had carried peppers and corn to the market in Malyshevo. Only parts of their bodies were visible. I couldn't see all of their faces. One had an arm resting across her forehead. One had a bandage covering most of her head. One of the dead was missing, an 18-month-old child. We'd seen some dogs on the way up the trail. Morgan Morris, the dauntless UN Refugee Agency field officer, who had led us to the scene, said what all of us were thinking. The dogs probably got the body. She was right, of course, but none of us wanted to be the one to say it. We'd just seen the mother resting in a house in the village a couple of kilometers away. She had a bullet in her upper arm. The bullet had passed through her baby, then through her breast, before lodging in her arm. The father said the baby was killed instantly. The bullet tore the child in half, he said. He had dragged the mother away to a small house in the village. A doctor from the Red Cross was treating her wounds. There were 10 women and 72-year-old man sitting in one stifling, airless room of the house, all of their backs against the wall, lost in their pain and their thoughts, waiting. We had made our way to this little village called Senik because Morgan Morris, the UN officer, had called us the night before and said, hey, the Serbs fired mortars at a bunch of women and children and then swept through with infantry and machine guns. So we went up the next day, and that's what we found. We went up from the village into this small valley just around the hill where many of the civilians had gone to hide because the mortars were landing in the village. And then the Serbs shelled the valley and came through with an infantry sweep and killed these women and that child and wounded the 11 others and that 72-year-old man. So we were standing around in the valley. We could see the Serbs up on the ridge line, and we stood there while they buried their dead. And this is what happened next. The villagers wanted to bury the dead in plain sight of the ridge line, where we could still see the Serbian snipers. The land, they said, had been taken from them in the 1940s, and they had reclaimed it in the 1970s. It belonged to these people, and they were going to be sure the Serbs understood that. The women they were burying were born in this valley and had spent their lives raising crops in its fields and giving birth to their children in the small houses that made up the hardscrabble town. We parked our vehicles in plain view as a deterrent to further shooting. Certainly the Serbs wouldn't shoot at EU or US observers or the white and blue UNHCR vehicle. Nonetheless, I was shaky standing around at the base of the draw. The ground was hard, and it took some time to bury the dead. The men worked with shovels and picks for about an hour to dig the graves for the women. Afterward, we stopped on the way out of the draw and used our satellite telephone to call Washington and tell the State Department's Operations Center what we had seen. It seemed very far away from that hillside. The officer on the line was a colleague, a classmate, a friend. Had it been someone else, I might have been more animated in my description of the scene, but Doug understood what was happening without my resorting to histrionics. 11 wounded, 10 women, 1 72-year-old man, 7 dead, 6 women and 1 child. Yes, I counted them myself. Yes, we're sure they were dead. I verified it personally. I left out the part about the dogs. We made one more stop on the way off the hill. An old man flagged us down as we were leaving the draw for the village and told our interpreter he wanted to show us something the Serbs had done. I glanced through the window and saw a group of women sitting on the floor, rocking slowly, comforting each other. They surrounded the body of another woman. She was laid out on her back and wrapped in a blanket. Part of her face and head were missing. What remained was veiled in a colorful scarf. The man said a mortar round had exploded within a meter of her head. He held his hands out in front of his body to demonstrate the distance. The sitting women wailed in unison as he said this. He was the dead woman's father. Amid the crying and the smell and the flies, we listened to his story. Having felt safe enough in her house to remain there with her husband and the children rather than moving up with the others, she decided to take some food up to her neighbors hiding in the small canyon. She was at the base of the draw when the attack started. The mortar shells probably came in groups of 3. Punk, 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 as they left the tubes, then an agonizing, breathless 5 or 6 second wait while they flew, and finally the brittle karam, 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 barking and echoing off the walls of the canyon. As they exploded, the gunners probably set the fuses to go off about 1.5 or 2 meters above the ground, about head high. It was an awful story. I couldn't wait to get out of there, away from the smell and the crying and the death. I felt outraged and horrified that soldiers would fire mortars at women and children. I had to look away. I concentrated on the colors in the woman's headscarf rather than her wounds. I watched the other women rocking slowly. I looked at the woman's father. My partner, Rob, photographed her body. I took notes about what her father said. Then we left, 8 dead. Down the hill at the intersection marking Seneca proper, a crowd of women and a few men had gathered. Some boys were sitting by the edge of the road with a wooden box filled with cigarettes, crackers, and chiclets. They're entrepreneurs. They sat expressionless as a small crowd swarmed our vehicle. I pushed open the door and stood pinned against the truck by the crowd as my translator echoed staccato pleas for help. One woman pushed through the crowd and held her baby at arm's length in front of me. I was face to face with the child while the mother spoke deliberately but calmly. She wants you to take her son out of here so the Serbs won't kill him, Mimosa said. I looked at the woman and said to Mimi, make sure she knows we can't do that. Say this, we are observers. We can't relocate you or your son. If we do, the government in Belgrade will order all of us out of the country. I felt feckless and impotent as the words spilled out. For the first time, I understood the folly of being in the war only to observe, a tourist among the victims. It was hot, and with the sun beating down on me, I felt cowardly, yellow, hiding behind my sunglasses. I waved my notebook at the Red Cross panel truck and said that was the vehicle that would take them to safety. I thought the Red Cross would probably refuse, but I was unable to muster the courage to tell the woman and the 50 other people crowded around me that there was little hope that we'd get out that day with an international. I found out later I'd been wrong. Several UN officers arrived late in the day, and one of them took it upon herself to evacuate some of the children to a safer village. Before we left, we went back to the house where the wounded were being treated. I had to tell the mother of the missing child that we didn't find her baby. It would have served no purpose to tell her what we thought had happened. I couldn't have found those words anyway. That evening, after we returned to our office, after we washed our truck, I drafted my report. It was only about 3 pages long, no speculation, just the things we understood to have happened based on what we saw and what was reported to us. I said that it appeared a Serbian infantry unit had swept through the valley from north to south, preceded by a barrage of mortar fire. During the barrage and subsequent infantry sweep, 7 women and 1 infant had been killed, and 11 others wounded, including a 72-year-old man. Vehicles and clothes, food and other supplies were burned in the sweep. I said we'd seen no evidence of weapons or any insurgent activity in the village or among the villagers. I didn't mention the funeral or the dogs. I didn't mention the woman begging me to take some action to save her child. I didn't mention the look on the old man's face. I carefully caveated what was told to us versus what we saw ourselves with qualifiers like reportedly and allegedly. I carefully made the people and the events in the village the center of the report rather than my own actions or my own feelings. Never star in your own report. I let my teammates read the report to ensure that we all agreed with it, and then I turned it into the reports officer, our editor. I had made a crisp, dry account of a messy, horrible act of cruelty, and in doing so, I had documented a war crime. That was what our days were like in Kosovo for about a year. We would go places, usually the day after there'd been an attack, and document a war crime, and document ethnic cleansing, and document crimes against humanity. Sometimes we'd be kept out of a village while something was going on. Towards the end, in January of 1999, right before the bombing campaign began, there was a little village called Rachak. We knew something was going on out there, so we drove out and we were kept out of the village by the Serbian Ministry of the Interior Police. So we all sort of pulled our vehicles up onto the hill, the European observers and the American observers. And we sat on the hill where we could hear firing going on in the village. We couldn't really see very much. We stayed till late in the day, and then we were supposed to be back at the office by sunset because it was dangerous, they told us. So we came back around 3:30 or 4. That night at dinner, I got a call from a friend, and she said, the Serbs killed 45 people in Rachak today. So while we were sitting on the hill, the Serbs were killing 45 innocent men and women and children. So we went back the next day and wrote down all their names and documented what had happened. And within 6 weeks, the bombing campaign began. And then we went and talked to all the people that had been driven out for 3 months. And then we went back in and helped them rebuild the country. I went from there to Rwanda, where I'd spent another couple of years earlier. And while I was in Rwanda, there was the ongoing remnants of the genocide, the ongoing insurgency coming in from eastern Zaire at that point. And while I was there, the attack on the United States on September 11th occurred. And I got a call from the Army saying, you're coming back to work for us, because I'd been a soldier for a long time and had stayed in the reserve. And they called me and they sent me to Afghanistan. And within a few weeks, I was really struggling. Memories of all the things that I'd seen and been a part of in Kosovo and Rwanda, in Eastern Congo, all of that ethnic cleansing, all of those memories started coming back to me. I couldn't control them. And I'd had a talk with one of the regional psychiatrists, the regional medical officers, while I was in Rwanda, and I said, I feel different. Something's really changed in me. And he said, you might have some small amount of post-traumatic stress disorder. Monitor, let me know what's going on. If you have problems, call me. And I felt okay, and then I went to Afghanistan. I didn't feel okay. This is what that was like. In the cold pre-dawn, I can hear generators running and vehicles moving on the other side of the base. But it's quiet inside my tent. None of the other soldiers I share the tent with is even snoring. I've been awake for a few hours, but I stay in my sleeping bag, fighting the nearly overwhelming urge to run away. The Taliban have launched a couple of rockets towards the base during the week, so we're all a little on edge. But that isn't what's keeping me up. I'm bundled into my sleeping bag, trying to control my racing heart, and trembling because the dead have come to talk to me. They've been coming every night for a couple of weeks, the dead from Kosovo or Rwanda, beckoning to me, pulling me from a warm, comforting sleep into a series of wretched, tormenting, wide-awake dreams. Tonight, it's the dead from a farm near the village of Podievo. Burned Bible black and twisted into hideous, contorted shapes, they lie in a cold rain that falls through the burned-away roofs and pools on the dirty floor. Do you remember us, they ask? Most assuredly. The night before, it had been the dead from the village of Rachak. 45 of them shot in the back of the head and left to die in a rocky ditch on that frozen January morning in 1999. They dropped by for a chat. Why didn't you do more to save us, they asked. Why indeed? Night after night, they appear on the big screen of my mind, an oversaturated technicolor, writhing and imploring. Night after night, the murdered and mutilated come back. Each time I'm scared and ashamed. I know they aren't real. I know they are only images in my head, but I fear them no less for knowing this. They terrify me for what they remind me of, the fighting I didn't stop, the lives I didn't save. They terrify me for what they represent, that I can no longer stop them from taking control of my mind. I lie on my bed trembling, eyes wide open, still seeing the dead in front of me. The trouble begins slowly, developing over time, and by the time I'm fully aware of it, I'm having graphic, violent dreams nightly. I wake from these dreams in a panic, shaking, heart racing, crying sometimes, always afraid to go back to sleep. I'm losing control of my brain, of my mind. In time, I even start seeing these images when I'm awake. During the day, I'm unable to concentrate. I sit at my desk or go to planning meetings for operations, shaking, until I have to leave the tent and go outside to get control of myself. I fear I've lost my mind, but I'm afraid to ask for help. I fear I'll be ridiculed, considered weak, and cowardly. In Army culture, especially in this elite unit filled with Rangers and paratroopers, asking for help is a sign of weakness. My 2 Bronze Star medals, my tours in airborne and special operations units, none of this will matter. To ask for help will be seen as breaking. But when I can no longer control the images in my head, when in the middle of the day I'm forced to hide, shaking and crying in a concrete bunker, railing against the noise and the images, when I realize that to continue to deny this will endanger the soldiers I was sent to Afghanistan to lead, I ask for help. So this is the early days of the war. This is 2003. It's not quite a year since the Rangers have jumped in to Kandahar. And we're all still working in tents, and your shower's in a tent, you sleep in a tent, you work in a tent. With some porta-johns over there. My buddy was the command surgeon for the 82nd Airborne. And I ran into him one morning going into the tent where we worked, the circus tent we called it, because it was a very big tent. And I stopped him and I said, yeah, Ed, I'm struggling. And sort of explained to him that I wasn't sleeping, I was afraid it might be affecting my work, I didn't really want to bother anybody, maybe I should talk to somebody. It's not a big deal, don't worry about it. I'll go shuffle through. And he did the thing that all military doctors are trained to do, where he gives you that look. And he goes, are you a danger to yourself or others? And the question is designed to make you think, but it's also designed to just get a very straight answer from you. Like, are you going to kill yourself or somebody else? Because everybody's walking around with a pistol, and everybody's walking around with an M4, and lots of bullets, and there's grenades and stuff. It's a war. And they give you that look like, you're the crazy one. Can I hold your weapon for a minute? And they usually take your weapon away from you. So you're no good to anybody. But what Ed did was ask me the question and waited for my answer. And I said, no, I don't think I'm a danger to myself or anyone else. I wasn't a danger to anyone else, certainly. Wasn't a danger to myself, though. So he made an appointment with me, for me, at the Combat Stress Center. And the Combat Stress Center is the psychological hospital. But they call it the Combat Stress Center because if you want to quit smoking, that's where you go. Because you've got to have cover, like your buddy sees you, hey, I saw you going into the combat stress center. Oh yeah, I'm quitting smoking. You don't smoke. See how it's working. Bueno, yeah, but I really feel like starting again, so. None of this, yeah, I've got PTSD and I'm struggling with it, because then you're the weak link. Then you're the broken one and nobody wants you on their team. I went down there and saw the psychiatrist, and while I was waiting, you walk in the door, and there's this big TV, huge TV, because they need some noise, because it's a tent, you hear what's going on, and there's people sitting in the back talking about medical problems. And so there's a big TV, and the nurse says, sit over there. I sat down. And here's Larry King on the TV talking to some ingenue, faded ingenue, and just telling us just how bloody important it is that we all remember how fabulous, and I had no idea this person was. And about that time, my attention was fading from Larry. And I sort of looked down, and right on the shelf, right there under the television, are the straitjackets. Nice and neat, folded up. And I was like, whoa! That's when you're like, oh, straitjacket. Yeah, tinfoil hat, straitjacket, I'm done. And I started going, I just start crying, and I'm rocking back and forth. Because I'm not well. And that's when the psychiatrist walks out and goes, Major Ken, come. And I'm waiting for the guys in the white jackets from the straitjacket. He was actually great. Found a way to treat me without putting it in my medical records. You know that the thing where they say this will go on your permanent record? It will. There is such a thing as a permanent record. And if you have a top secret security clearance, it's a black mark. He kept it out of my records, gave me the Prozac. I took the Prozac. Over time, I got better. I brought all my people home, and I came home alive. Came back to the State Department, folded up my uniforms, was out of the Army again. Came back to the State Department, got a job in the European Bureau. And I'm not a European Bureau guy. There are European Bureau people in the department, and then there are the rest of us. And I didn't know that, because I was still pretty new at this. I hadn't been in the service. I'd only been in 6-7 years. And nobody had told me this. Because when you show up at A100, they expect you to know everything. They never teach you anything there. It's just, you're expected to learn things by yourself. And so I didn't know that. And I had this, my first tasking was write a note from the Secretary of State to the American ambassador in France, declining an invitation. This is what we do? Yes. Okay. So I wrote a note, and I sent it back up, and about 10 seconds later it comes back with a little snippy comment on it. Earning me serious looks of disdain from my colleagues. You can't even write that? So I sent it up again. I tried it again. No, it comes right back. First it's totally Goldilocks, right? Too flippant, too dour. Third time, oh, fine. And I think they just wrote it themselves. And I realized that I was not a European Bureau person, particularly not a desk officer. I was horrible. Oh my God. I know that the office director, the deputy office director, all my colleagues were just aghast that I had been assigned to this office. And and rightly so, I sucked at this. And so after about 3 or 4 months of this, these friends of mine show up, and I hear this sort of, the door, and these smiling faces from my time in Afghanistan stick their head in, squeeze their in front of my desk, shut the door and say, we're going to Iraq, you want to go? And I was like, please, I will go anywhere. Get me out of here. And so we went off to Iraq, and we interviewed terrorists. And I thought that, this is okay, I can do this, this is good. But while I was in Iraq, I got an email from a buddy of mine at my Army Reserve unit that said, you're about to get mobilized to go to Iraq. So I called him, I was like, we're not doing this over email. The NSA can keep track of this, but we're going to do this on the phone. So I called him, and he said, yeah, well, the whole Abu Ghraib thing, half the military intelligence community was under investigation, and the other half weren't on active duty. So they were going to call us all back so they'd have people there. So I made an agreement with him that I would come back to active duty. I didn't want to go to Iraq. So they offered me 3 choices. One was Mauritania, And if you're not an Africa person, and you don't know the difference between Mauritius and Mauritania, look it up. Mauritius, good. Mauritania, not so good. Okay? And they said Mauritania, and I was like, yeah, okay, I know which one that is. What else? Go back to Eastern Congo and run around there. Done that. Go to Sudan. I'd always wanted to go to Sudan. It was just the kind of messed up place that I would be perfect in. And we were reopening the embassy. And so I was going to go back to Sudan as an army officer, as one of the military attachés. And I was waiting to get my visa, and Secretary Powell came on in front of the Congress and called what the Sudanese government was doing by its rightful name, genocide. Well, they were unhappy with that, and so we sat around for months waiting to get a visa. Finally, a good friend of mine who was the army attaché in Ethiopia at the time got me a visa. I landed. The Sudanese military would have nothing to do with any of us, so the traditional sort of liaison role between military attachés, not happening. So we were looking for work, and I went out to Darfur. I found a truck that I could drive. I found a place to stay, and I joined the African Union mission in Sudan as a peacekeeper. And our job was very much what the work was in Kosovo, to stop the fighting, and we couldn't do it. There were 1,200 of us in a place the size of France. Couldn't do it. Not possible. There were 200,000 dead in Darfur at that point. There was an ongoing genocide. It was my second genocide. There were 2.5 million displaced. I stayed there for about 9 months. When I left, there were 300,000 dead. And I don't have any idea how many displaced, but more. I got a call. Your mom is in hospital. The doctors say come home. So I drove down to Virginia Beach, where I grew up, spent a month sitting at my mom's bedside while she died. She died on a Tuesday. On Wednesday, I drove back to Washington to get a suit to wear at her funeral. Thursday, I had lunch at the White House with Deputy Secretary Zeller. Friday, I drove down to Virginia Beach, or Thursday night, I drove down to Virginia Beach. Had my mom's funeral, packed a few things out of her house, and started work back at the State Department on Monday. For those of you that are keeping track, that is not enough time. This is the theme that keeps running through the story. Is that I'm not taking care of myself. I'm not taking the downtime I need to recover. And I showed up at an office. I was technically the special assistant to the Assistant Secretary for African Affairs, which I knew was a placeholder job for me because I would suck at that just as bad as I sucked at the job in the European Bureau. And the Bureau knew it was a placeholder job for me, so they had to find something for me. And they asked me to go work in this office of the Sudanese Interests Office or something. That was a big office, all these people working there. And they gave me a room that was a copier room, with no windows, a little desk, one little light over above, and said, here's your desk. That was it. For the record, if you're an office director, don't do this to people. Don't put them in closets, especially when what people need is sunshine. So I wasn't doing very well. I was having panic attacks on the train. I was deep into another PTSD episode when someone walked in and said, hey, would you go back to Sudan for us? We want you to go and help train the African Union peacekeepers with the UN. Gets me out of the closet. Okay, I'll go. So I went on a UN mission to Darfur. And this is what happened.
What year are we talking about now?
This is 2005. I was in Iraq in 2004. I went to Al-Fashir in support of the United Nations mission to organize and run a training exercise for the African Union. I was the scenario writer. The 3 scenarios I'd written were roughly like this. A humanitarian emergency develops into a security crisis. Deal with it. A security crisis develops into a humanitarian catastrophe and includes significant press interest and bad weather. Deal with it. The kitchen sink of problems arrives sequentially. Deal with all of them. The Amos staff had an officer on the UN team who had helped with the details of the scenarios. He had the plots and he knew the solutions, and he gave these to his colleagues on the Amos staff. And they still failed. Personally, I was failing too. I was falling apart, in some ways worse than I had in Afghanistan, I was deep into a bad PTSD episode. I was drinking myself into a stupor every night in an Islamic republic where alcohol is banned. And I was carrying on a clandestine affair with a UN official. The genocide was actually diminishing, but we had no way of knowing that at the time. What I saw around me was 300,000 dead and 2.5 million displaced. I had no real safety net to catch me, nor anything during the day to hold me together. I had very few actual responsibilities. Since the scenarios were already written, I was mostly along for the ride with the UN team. Despite this, I was managing pretty well until one very bad day. The woman with whom I'd been having the affair for a couple of months asked me what would happen after our work together ended. We'd been at it for a few weeks, first in Nairobi, then in Addis, now in Darfur, having fun in nice hotels in Kenya and Ethiopia, and dodgy guest houses in Sudan, drinking, playing. But when she started making noises about next steps, that set off alarm bells in my head, dragging me back to the realization that I had a life outside this little war zone bubble. Soon I would have to go back to that life and the reckoning. I obviously wasn't rational. Nonetheless, I was functioning at a pretty high level, writing intricate scenarios for a modern-ish fighting force, operating in the middle of a complex emergency, continuing to collect information about the status of forces' disposition and actions, the government of Sudan's response to the insurgency, and writing reports for the embassy about what I'd learned. At the same time, I was carrying on this illicit affair. But in my head, I was convinced that my life was fucked up, and that all I was doing was hurting other people. I'd failed to stop the fighting in Darfur, just as I'd failed to do so in Kosovo and in Zaire. My writing sucked. My mom had just died. My marriage was a failure. I was a failure. Everything I touched brought pain to others. I wasn't getting better, I was getting worse. The dark stuff in my head triumphed over the rational, workaday reality. I decided to kill myself. I think I did so quite rationally. I thought about it through the morning, scripting the steps and the timing, mentally locating the tools I would need and sorting out their acquisition, thinking about the aftermath, both immediate and longer term. By lunchtime, I had a plan. By mid-afternoon, I'd acquired all the tools. Late that afternoon, I began work. I grabbed a couple of beers out of the icebox, wrapped them in a t-shirt, and put them on the seat of the Toyota. Earlier in the afternoon, I'd gone over to the U.S. team house and borrowed a pistol from the Special Forces team sergeant. He loaned it to me, no questions asked, because we'd worked together for 6 months or so, and he had no reason to suspect that I was anything other than a competent, professional career officer. I drove out of town to the west, somewhat dramatically, I realized, into the setting sun, towards the reservoir. I pulled off the main road to the north side, towards some small villages, just clusters of huts, really, and stopped the truck on a low rise, just high enough to see the sun falling towards the desert. I opened one of the beers. I started crying, but I don't really know why. I was filled with a sense of failure, frustration, a sense of conclusion. Nothing I touched succeeded. Nothing I did was good. I'd been through 5 wars in 10 years and done nothing to stop the killing in Rwanda, Kosovo, Afghanistan, Iraq, or Darfur. I felt as if I'd reached a logical place in my life to end it. I opened the second beer. I picked the pistol up off the seat. It felt good in my hand. I felt surprisingly deft with it. I pointed it out the windshield with the magazine resting on the steering wheel, and I curled my finger around the trigger. I imagined pulling the trigger and the immediate pull the weapon would make as the round fired. There wasn't anything to shoot at out there, so I would have just blown out the windshield. But even if there was something to shoot at, I was holding the pistol in my right hand, and I'm left-handed, so I probably couldn't have hit it. I put the pistol back on the seat. I remember a momentary flash of clarity. Who else could I hurt if I did this? My wife, certainly. Anyone else? My sister, maybe. I thought that what I was getting ready to do would leave a hole in some lives. I even thought about someone having to clean up the truck afterwards. Maybe I'd do it outside and leave less of a mess. But the clarity passed, and I was overwhelmed with a sense of futility and sadness. I had failed to stop the wars. So many people were dead because of my failures. Images were rushing at me, the 45 dead from Rajak, the raped nun from Bunia, the man with the red-rimmed eyes and a mutilated family near Senek. I picked up the pistol and charged it, loading a bullet into the firing chamber. My hands were shaking. I put the beer down and took the pistol off safe. was sobbing, talking to myself, to the spheres, to no one. The pistol was ready. I shifted it to my left hand. I looked at it in my hand, lying partly on my lap, and pointed down a bit. I took a deep breath to calm myself. I was ready. Then the phone rang. It scared the hell out of me, and I jumped, startled. I almost pulled the trigger, which would have been highly ironic, to shoot myself in the foot while preparing to shoot myself in the head. I looked at the phone lying on the seat of the pickup and saw it was my wife, Maureen, calling from Washington. Was this serendipity? Karma? Luck? Just uncanny timing. With my thumb, I put the pistol back on safe and laid it on the seat. While I talked to Maureen for a few minutes, I stared out through the windshield and watched the sun setting over the rocky brown desert of Darfur. The ringing phone had broken the spell. After the crying and the shaking, the moralizing and justifying, the calming of hands and nerves, the intense focus on the immediate act of charging the weapon, and then taking off the safety and preparing to put the barrel in my mouth, the ringing phone pulled me back from the brink. So I survived that day. I turned the pistol back into the Special Forces guys that I was working with, and called the doctor. I said, I need to go home. For the first time, it was in my permanent record, my records, that I had a mental health problem. I admitted I had a permanent mental health problem. So I was medevaced home. In the language of the department, this is called a psychovac, or a psychovac. On my way out, it took about 2 weeks to get the orders and the tickets and all that. I was looking for a job back in Washington. I figured out that I would land in INR, in the Office of Analysis for Africa. But I sat down at the computers and I wrote sort of a going away cable. I'd been in Darfur for almost 2 years, 22 months. And I was pretty sure that our policies there weren't going to succeed. I figured, you know, I'm screwing myself with this medevac anyway, this psychovac anyway, so I may as well just get it off my chest. So I wrote a descent channel cable called Darfur, Who Will Apologize? And I based the title on the idea that a couple of years after the Rwandan genocide, President Clinton flew to Rwanda, never left the airport, and gave a speech there where he said, we didn't know. We just didn't know. We're real sorry. And he apologized to the people of Rwanda for not coming to save them. And so I explained to the secretary, because that's who these cables are supposed to go to, that her policies in his policies in Darfur were going to fail. So we'd had 2 presidents and 3 secretaries of state say this is genocide, yet we were spending almost all our money putting food into the refugee camps rather than stopping the government of Sudan from committing genocide. And I said, here's what we're doing wrong, here's what we have to do to make it happen. And if you don't do this, this is the logical outcome of that. And I sent that off. Well, I was ready to send it off, and I think it's important to send these to your boss so that he doesn't get blindsided. My boss was Cameron Hume, and he was at the peace talks in Abuja. So I sent a copy to him, and he sent it out. I said, this is fine. If you want to send it, go ahead. Here's what will happen. You'll get a response back from the policy planning staff, and maybe 6 or 7 people will read this cable. I'll make you an offer. You can do that, or we can craft something together that neither one of us will be happy with, or you can send this, but I get to put a paragraph at the top. And if you do that, we'll send it through open channels, and everybody can see it, and you can figure out who you want to address it to. And I thought that's pretty good. So we did that. And I sent it out the next day. It was the 28th of April. A couple days later, I left Sudan. For the record, I never got a response. Nobody's required to respond to a cable. An official response. A number of my friends in the Africa Bureau wrote me and said, wow, interesting. Policy did not change, though genocide's still going on there. There were probably another 100,000 people dead, another 100,000, another 500,000 displaced. But I didn't expect policy to change. Nobody who writes a descent channel cable expects to change policy. You just get it off your chest, you turn around and go back to work. The next summer, The American Foreign Service Association awarded me the William R. Rifkin Award for intellectual, what is it they call it? Intellectual courage and the creative use of dissent. And I'm very honored to receive that award, named for an American diplomat who was also an Army Lieutenant Colonel and recipient of the Bronze Star, as was I. But I came back, went to my office full of introverts. Now, you know the joke about introverts at the State Department? Is that you can tell the introverts from the extroverts, and the extroverts will stare at your shoes while they talk to you. This was an office full of introverts, and I fit right in, man. Everybody just sits in your office. Everybody sets their desks up so the desk is facing the wall, and their back is to the door, and they can just do this. And it was perfect for me, but nobody bothered checking in to say, are you getting medical care? Are you taking care of yourself because you were psych-evac'd out? None of that. I stayed in that job for about 2 years until I lost my security clearance. My security clearance was taken from me in the summer of, it was suspended, it was never taken from me. It was suspended in the summer of 2008. I waited a few months, we figured out that these investigations take somewhere between 6 and 7 years to play out. And I didn't want to walk the halls for 6 or 7 years. So I retired at the end of 2008. Took a job working for a nonprofit right up the street, and went back to graduate school at Johns Hopkins and studied writing. What I was doing was writing this book. I didn't really realize it at the time, but all the time that I'd been in Kosovo and Rwanda and Afghanistan and Iraq and Darfur, I'd come back from work after writing these crisp, dry accounts of messy, horrible acts of cruelty, and I would write the remainders. I'd write the things that were left over. And that's what this book is. That's what this book became. I go to graduate writing workshops and hand in something like what you've just heard, and people would come back sort of aghast and like, thanks. And everybody else is writing stories about unicorns and rainbows. So they weren't real happy with me, but eventually I did graduate. They'd be like, thank you, move on. I graduated, and I did get help. I went to the VA. And it took a while, but I got help. But this is the last little bit I'll read, because I've taken up a lot of time. This is what life is like my very first day at the VA. The old guy in front of me was using one of those canes with 4 rubber tips at the base as he crept towards the hospital door. It was the last week of July in Washington, D.C. The temperature was at least 90 degrees with intolerably cruel humidity. And he was wearing a tan golf jacket that, as I passed him, I saw was zipped up to the throat. It made me feel even hotter just to look at it. At least he had a ball cap on, one with World War II veterans stitched onto the front. That should keep the sun off his head anyway. Like me, he was carrying a large brown folder. Mine held medical records, some service documentation like orders and award certificates, and notes from my combat deployments. It was my first visit to the VA hospital. The Washington VA Medical Center is as charmless a building as one can imagine. A big white box in the center of half a dozen parking lots that are constantly in overflow. In short, it looks like most big hospitals in any major city. And in many ways, I suppose, it is like any other hospital, filled with the sick and the infirm, healthcare and administrative staff scurrying about, bad coffee. But in one very important way, it is entirely different. It is the place where combat veterans enter the system for the treatment of wounds, both physical and psychological. Walking in from the parking lot, I started to feel all the familiar sensations. The stress rising in my gut, vision focus narrowed, breathing short and irregular, memories of 5 wars and images of the dead hovering just off stage. Inside the door, there was an information desk with a guy in a wheelchair behind it wearing a DAV piss cutter cap. He looked me up and down, no doubt making some sort of judgment about me. I couldn't imagine what it might have been. I stammered a bit, explaining I'd come for my first appointment. My hands were shaking, so I held them down below the edge of the counter. He quietly told me where the registration office was and pointed the way. Walking through the lobby, I imagined everyone was looking at me thinking, look at the psycho boy home from the war and broken. What a pussy. I felt like it was my first day in high school and I was dressed in a bright pink tutu. I took a number and waited. The waiting room was actually part of the main lobby, so it was noisy and there were lots of people walking past. I kept my head down until my number was called. Inside the office, a woman looked over my paperwork. I'd brought some of my DD-214s, the document that details the veteran's military service, showing training, awards, and decorations, combat time served, and so forth. And then she started entering my data into the system. She was perfectly pleasant, and she did a good job of ignoring my symptoms until she asked if I wanted to go to the emergency room instead of the green clinic. Maybe I should have. At my psychological screening upstairs in the mental health wing, away from the general medical patients, I was interviewed by someone new to the system, maybe a recent PhD graduate, with a more qualified, I assume, supervisor attended. I had to detail all my problems in full. I started at the beginning in Rwanda, then Kosovo, then Afghanistan, and my treatment there for PTSD, then Iraq, then Darfur, and my failed suicide attempt, and on, through the drive to the hospital that morning. Staring at the floor, wringing my hands, I quietly described memory loss, my unbridled fear and anxiety, my inability to control images of the dead appearing in my head at all hours of the day and night, my weird hypervigilance issues. I even included the wholly irrational things like getting lost in my own neighborhood, going to the grocery store at midnight because no one else would be there, my anxiety while driving because I can't control what the lunatic in the Lexus is going to do. At that point, the supervisor snickered. There was an ugly silence in the room for a few seconds, and the only sounds being the air conditioning blowing in through the grate in the wall and someone's heels clicking down the hallway outside the closed door. I looked up. The interviewer looked stricken, and her supervisor quickly looked down at her notes. Shame welled in my throat and my eyes. My humiliation was absolute. Even the doctors were laughing at me. Welcome to the VA, psycho boy. I got treatment at the VA, and I had used my VA benefits to go to graduate school. Thank you very much. Your tax dollars is good. And as I was leaving grad school one night, I went to Johns Hopkins. I was driving home from class one night, and I was getting to that point where I'm getting close to the end of the program. So you know, maybe you've had this experience, you're getting close to something end, and you're like, what next? What am I going to do now? Well, with the graduate program, I was thinking, what am I going to do with this? I've been using your dollars to go to graduate school, maybe I should do something with it. What next? Ooh, I'm going to be a better writer. Yay. And the idea came to me that I could give it away. I could take all of that knowledge from graduate school, all the knowledge I was gaining as a working writer. I was writing for Time magazine, foreign policy, the American interest. Take that and I could give it away to others so that they could tell their stories. And over a couple of weeks, I came up with the idea of founding the Veterans Writing Project, and I did so a little over 3 years ago. And we're a nonprofit based in Washington, D.C. We are veterans serving other veterans. We provide no-cost writing workshops and seminars for military veterans, service members, and their adult family members. We also publish a literary journal called ODARK 30, where we publish fiction, nonfiction, poetry, and plays. We've been around for about 3 years. We're in partnership with the National Endowment for the Arts to present therapeutic writing workshops up at Walter Reed. And just 2 weeks ago, we started teaching at the VA hospital, the very same VA hospital where I was treated. So we're making progress. I spent more or less 15 years writing this book. That opening line that I started with, yellow, their skin was yellow. I started writing that in 1999 in Kosovo. I finished that in about 2011 when I left Johns Hopkins. And over that year, I shopped the book around up in New York. I shopped all that writing around. Didn't sell it in New York, but did find a publisher about a year ago. Signed a contract with that publisher, and the book came out on the 1st of May. So I tell people that I used that writing. I found a way to write my way home. When medical treatment wasn't working for me, when medical treatment and too much whiskey wasn't working for me, when medical treatment, whiskey, and talk therapy wasn't working for me, writing is what worked. And any of the creative arts can do this. Writing just happens to be what works for me. I am happy to take any questions. Thank you again for coming. It's a great pleasure to read here at AFSA. And if you have any questions, I'm happy to take them. Otherwise, thank you very much.
Great. The obvious question, how you doing?
The obvious question, how am I doing? I'm better in many ways. In January, after 6 years on meds, I tried to get off meds. I'd gone through different cocktails, you know, try this, adjust this up, bring this down, take more of that, less of this. Boy, that makes me feel funny. I'll take that more. I tried to get off meds in January and didn't do very well, so I'm back on meds. I teach at 2 psychiatric hospitals, so I always feel like I can reach out if I need help, but I call the book Seriously Not Alright. I don't explain this in a lot of the stories, but the psychiatrist that I saw in Afghanistan told me you have to keep track of how you're doing. And that was it, just keep track of how you're doing, no guidance beyond that. So I came up with a sort of continuum between I feel all right, whatever that means, to vaguely not all right, to seriously not all right. And bad days are seriously not all right. And so I'll say I haven't had any seriously not all right days in a while. I feel a little better. Thank you for asking. Sir?
I've had some experiences similar to yours, and I wondered, in your experience, has State Department attitude and approach to PTSD and these kinds of situations improved over the years?
I've been gone since 2008, so I can't say what's happened since I've been gone. I am told that they now have an office that sort of focuses on these issues, but I don't know. I've spent most of my time working with military veterans. I have gone down and talked, I've been invited to go down and talk to the folks at USAID, and have talked a little bit with some folks working on resilience issues out at AFSA, but nothing formal yet. So I don't know. I don't know what the answer is to the question, sorry. Yes?
Why was your security clearance taken away?
My security clearance was suspended. Suspended. Again, I'm a field guy, you know, so I'm not used to a lot of bureaucracy, and I did something stupid. While I was in Chad, the embassy didn't have any laptops that worked. They had 4 laptops and none of them worked. So I was using my laptop. I was using my Apple Mac, going downrange, living in the field, and in order and I would write these reports, this is what I saw, this is what I did, but we had no secure communications. We didn't have it in Kosovo, we didn't have it in most places that I worked. We'd not had a secure link because we weren't in embassies. So I would go to the UN office in El Fasher or Gareda, and there'd be this satellite uplink there that any NGO worker could use. And I would sign in, even though I was from the US Embassy. I'd sign in, and I would sit down and get in line with all the other NGO people, and I would have my computer, and I would use a little memory stick, and I would load the message I wanted to send onto the memory stick. I'd stick it into this UN computer, go into my Yahoo account, and upload to the defense attaché, to his Yahoo account. And then he would do some sort of magic that I don't understand, because it's a computer, and it would then transfer into the secret system. I had nothing to do with that. All I was doing was writing a report. Well, I came back and I had 4 or 5 months worth of these. And I landed back in my office in INR. And there are, surprise, there are rules. And I didn't really pay attention to the rules. So I stuck this unclassified drive into the classified computer, uploaded all of these reports, and sent them off to CIA, DIA, NGA, the big 5. My analyst buddies over there. And then was invited to go and talk to a new task force that had been formed at DIA. Went over there, said, here, you guys need these more than I do. I gave them all the reports on the drive. When the DS agents inevitably show up at your door and they say, where's the drive? I didn't have it. So they didn't believe that simultaneously, what was that guy's name? Kenyon something? The guy that was spying for the Cubans?
Kendall Myers.
Kendall Myers.
Good friend of mine.
Kendall Myers was arrested about 15 minutes later.
Right.
So they thought, ooh, we got another Kendall Myers. No, what they have is a middle-aged guy with PTSD that can't remember shit.
So it wasn't the security clearance suspension, nothing to do with your service-related PTSD?
As far as I know,
Okay, it was totally
I do not
separate,
know.
totally separate.
I do not know. It had a lot to do with my service-related PTSD. They kept asking me, when did you do this? I'm like, hell, I don't know. But basically, this was a transaction. This was going in and uploading a document. How many of those do you do a day? How many of those do you remember? I don't have any idea. You know, plus. So they didn't believe me, and I didn't want to wait 6 or 7 years for them to get around to making a decision. I had divorced previously and got married again. My wife had a job in DC. I was supposed to go be the DCM in Chad. I was an 01 political officer. I was going to be DCM in Chad. I was in the DCM course when they pulled me out to tell me that I couldn't go. So whether it was directly related, you know, I mean, I'd written a Descent Channel cable. I'd been kind of a thorn in the side, been a pain in the ass. Is that relevant? I don't know. I'll never know.
The reason I'm asking is because I have heard that Med has told some people if you declare service-related PTSD, that your security clearance will be in danger. And
Well, I think that anyone who's got a top secret clearance has to answer question 21 on the form. And question 21 on the form says, have you had mental health care? And for DOD now, and I don't know what state does, I can't answer it, but I know for DOD, they've changed that question. It says, have you had mental health care other than for an adjustment following combat? So if you come back and you're getting treatment for PTSD, no blood, no foul. But that question did not exist when I was in service, and I was told the same thing. And I actually talk about this in the book, going to our security officer and saying, what happens? And she gave me the list. These are the medications you can't take. These are the medications maybe you can take. But it was a judgment call. And so I don't know what was in my security records, but you know, the guys had access to everything. So. Yes, ma'am.
Ron, in some of the interviews I've heard you give, you've kind of commented that military culture is a little uneven in its acceptance of PTSD, and that your own recovery, you've experienced uneven reactions from people. Do you feel that the trend is improving regarding how that community is willing to deal with and absorb and heal PTSD, or, you know, or is it stagnant? Do you have any observations on that?
I do. And the answer is, again, I don't really know once you get outside of a very small circle. I teach active service members with PTSD and traumatic brain injuries up at Walter Reed. I've been up there every Wednesday afternoon for 2.5 years. It's the best day of the week. They all get it. But the vast majority of the people coming through this very, very specialized program are special operators. They're from the Special Operations Forces. Many of them are SEALs. That community has put so much time and energy into training these people. There are so few of them that the community will do anything it takes to keep them healthy and keep them in service. That said, a lot of the guys are at the end of their career anyway, so they're just like, I gotta get treatment. I know that ongoing, there's a stigma attached to asking for mental health care. The whole idea really for all of us is get beyond the idea that mental health care differs from health care. It's just health care, right? If you break your ankle, you know, I was in airborne units, and if you break your ankle, they laugh at you. They go, you're stuck in the S3 shop making PowerPoint slides for a few months, but then you come back, and you're like, hey, you're one of us, you've got you're jump qualified, you can jump with us. If you get PTSD, it's like, ooh, you're the weak link. You're the chink in the armor, and nobody wants to be the weak link or the chink in the armor. You don't want to let your friends down. You don't want to let the guys, and it's mostly guys in these units, let them down. That said, recently, a number of senior people, including a now retired 4-star general, have come out and said, stay. Said that he had PTSD. His name is Carter Ham. He was the commander of AFRICOM and then of European Command. And Army Magazine from AUSA, the Association of United States Army, they ran a review of my book, and he was the guy that reviewed it. So they got a 4-star review of the book, which I thought was nice. A guy named Gary Patton, no relation to the Patton, but same name, is now a 2-star. He came out after brigade command tour. He was a colonel. Said, yeah, I got problems with PTSD. Still made brigadier, still made major general. Most of these men who have received the Medal of Honor recently have said they have PTSD. Most of them. So, when the guy wearing the blue cord says he's got it, people have to say, okay, I guess it's all right. It's not happened. And part of the issue is, even within the United States, we're just scared of crazy people. We are. Just being crazy is bad. And part of the reason is that there's a real lack of mental health care professionals in the United States. Think of 3 different systems: the civilian healthcare system, the VA, and the military healthcare system. Across those 3, there's a shortage of psychiatrists, psychologists, and social workers. So we don't have enough people to treat the problems we have. Somebody else had a question. Ma'am?
Do you think if your career had been limited just to the foreign service that you would have had similar problems with PTSD, or was it because of your military career that it kind of magnified the effect?
I don't think it would have made any difference. In perspective, I would not have gotten into the Foreign Service had I not been in the military first. I just wouldn't have had the interest in it. I would have known about it. You know, I still would have been playing guitar down at Virginia Beach. And have a bunch of ex-wives and some DUIs. You know, so it was sort of like, you know, instead of the judge telling me join the Army or go to jail, I was just like, I'm going to join the Army. And I did, and it changed me, and I was much for the better. I will tell you, I got shot at a hell of a lot more often in the Foreign Service than I did as a soldier. Because the Foreign Service is much more expeditionary now than it used to be. You know, the days when, you know, the term that Kissinger used, striped pants cookie pushers, that doesn't exist anymore. That Foreign Service is gone. And good riddance. You know, the Foreign Service today is much more, and I'm not trying to recruit anybody here, trust me. You know, I'll tell you warts and all about the Foreign Service. But it's much more representative of America. My class, my A100 class, we had 20 people in that class out of 50. 20 of those people were part of a lawsuit, and they came to the Foreign Service because of a lawsuit where women had to sue the Foreign Service because they weren't being taken seriously. And 20 women came into the Foreign Service the same day I did, because the Foreign Service needed to become more representative of America. But, you know, Kosovo, I was there for the Foreign Service. Darfur, I was there for the Foreign Service. Half the time I was in Iraq, I was there for the Foreign Service. Half the time I was in Central Africa, I was there as a Foreign Service officer. I would have been just as messed up, maybe more so. We'll start with that, and then.
Yes, I've always thought that everyone should have a mental health evaluation, and, you know, because people who check that box, I mean, how about the people who should have been seeing a mental health counselor and didn't? So the discrimination, I think, in that question is bad, and it prevents people from getting the help they need. Second of all, I agree with you, you know, Foreign Service, you also have consular officers dealing with deaths and murders.
Terrible disasters.
Horrible
Tsunamis
disasters.
and earthquakes.
And when you said quite well, you know, you had no safe place to go. Well, a lot of single people in the Foreign Service, and they're in these places, and they've got no one to vent to. It's really very difficult situation. So I commend you for putting this book out. And I'm wondering what else you think the State Department should be doing, besides what I think they should be doing, making sure there's a mental health evaluation for everyone across the board, to make the system work better.
There's probably not much more they can do than that. You know, the thing about it is, I had mental health evaluations, you know, but you're sitting there in the clinic, you know, and when I was leaving Afghanistan, you give you this long form, and everybody that's leaving that day or that week, you know, gets the same form. And you're like, shut up. I would have signed anything to get on that plane, you know? Yes, you may have my soul. Take it.
They have to reduce the
You know,
stigma.
just get me out of here. But yeah, the whole idea is that I wrote, when I was writing for Time Magazine, I was writing about this issue quite a bit. And it's, you know, people are like, oh, well, we shouldn't call it post-traumatic stress disorder. Disorder's a bad word. And at first I was just like completely against this. No, you have to give it a name. Just stick with the name you've got. Now my thinking's evolved on that, but the relevant point is that it's not a lexicon issue. It's a leadership issue. And then when every corporal and every sergeant in the Army and the Marines gets over the idea that mental health care is different than health care, and every lieutenant and captain and the assignments officers all get over this, we will take a huge step forward. Until then, it's something we're going to have to fight. We will be swimming upstream is what I'm trying not to say, but I'll just say swimming upstream. Yeah, you had a question.
You've also worked with the UN, UNHCR, and others, and with NGOs in the field with refugees. do you find that their experience, you talked about these foreign service and the U.S. military, can you then add, looking at the UN, people who work with traumatic issues, and NGOs who do the same thing, and refugee camp service, do they have a different way to deal with it?
No, they have the same problems we do.
Okay.
They have exactly the same problems. And what's left out of this are contractors, because we aren't paying them. We aren't taking care of them. We pay them a lot when they're in the field, and then once they're home, it's like, you're gone. And many of them are from places where there just isn't mental health care. They're not from Reston, right? You know, most of the contractors overseas, the vast majority of them are from small third world countries where they're just coming in. They're the guys that take out the trash, they're the guys that drive the shit truck, they're the guys that do all the hard work. And they're going home just as messed up into something that's nowhere near what we're coming back to. And journalists. Don't forget about them. So I mean, the entire community goes over there, and the entire community comes back. And then, oh, by the way, all the people that have to stay and live through it. So all the people in Iraq, imagine what their lives are like. All the people in Afghanistan, all the people in Syria, the Ukraine, you know, Liberia, you know, there's no shortage of war. And all those people are still, they're just there. You know, there's no getting away from it. Man.
To get away from the mental health aspect of it, which is, of course, very interesting for me, but do you think there's still a role for just plain observers in these kind of conflicts and genocide and war crime locations? You mentioned, here we were observers, we're up on the ridge, and all those people were killed, but we're just observers. Do you think there's still a role for that, and maybe peacekeepers, which I'm not sure if they can go in and stop murder?
Yeah. The job that I took when I left the Foreign Service was with Refugees International, and I was running a program for them, trying to find ways to improve the capacity of international peacekeeping, because that's certainly one of the peacekeeping missions. So yeah, I thought about this a lot. The role for international observers. There's a huge difference in someone with a mandate going in and serving as an official observer, military observer, diplomatic observer, and what's going on in Gaza now, where Israelis bring their chairs and sit up on the hill and watch the bombs.
Yeah.
That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about someone with a mandate, with a tasking to report. You know, and for all the sense of failure that I had for not stopping the fighting, my reporting and the reporting of my team ended up at The Hague being presented in Milosevic's case. And so there's a special place in hell. If there's a hell, there's a special place for him. And he's there. And I can feel like, you know, my reporting helped get him there. You know? And so at the end of all of this, I feel like I did some good. You know? That I was in place in Darfur, and I knew enough about what was going on that I called back to the State Department, went completely outside the chain of command, called back to the State Department, and told a friend of mine working for the Deputy Secretary that if someone didn't force the African Union's hand to put peacekeepers into this little tiny village, that village was going to go away the next day. And I knew it would, because both sides had told us, we're going to fight right here. And you have 48 hours. And so I made that phone call, and the next day, the African Union moved 30 Nigerian peacekeepers into that village. And as far as I know, that village still exists.
Wow.
And so there's small successes. And that's the value of having people in place. You know, would I like to have done more? Yeah, I wrote to the secretary and said, you should be doing more. And here's what you should be doing. But, you know, it's hard. I did what I could. There is a value to it. I see the value. International peacekeeping is a vast morass that I don't really want to go into, but it needs to be better. It needs to be stronger. And why isn't the United States involved? There's about 20 United States international peacekeepers. Maybe 50 now, but the number was usually around 20 when I was looking at it. Sir, yeah, and then we'll come. Yes.
I was just curious about your security clearance suspension. You indicated because you had uploaded to a classified system from your flash drive, but you had uploaded to the UN system, which would not have had a U.S. classification. Are you saying because someone else then?
No, I uploaded it here in the building. That's what they were
I
upset
see.
about.
I see, it wasn't.
I was back here in INR,
Okay.
and I plugged it right into the top secret system and
Because I
sent it
thought
up.
what was getting.
Oh, they couldn't
at
care less
was
about
that
what happens in the
someone
field.
else later classified
Yeah.
your information.
They were happy with that system,
Oh, okay.
because that was getting system, you know, I was an FSO 1, they were looking for somebody to stick it to. They did. Yeah.
I don't know if you mentioned this, but what was added to the beginning of your descent cable that,
Oh, Cameron's paragraph, it was really nice. Cameron, if you don't know Cameron Hume, he's about the size of a refrigerator. And he doesn't have much of a neck, and he's got one of those really intense glares that would just scare the hell out of him. You know, and he doesn't have he has a temper, but it's mostly under control. So at the country team meeting, somebody will say something, and you'll just see his eyes get real narrow. And everybody kind of leans back. The light bulb goes by like, there's a smoking symbol. But he's also a hell of a smart guy. I mean, he was ambassador 4 or 5 times. You know, big countries, big troubled countries, Algeria, Indonesia, Sudan, you know, big troubled countries. And so he sends me this note, he says, look, I'm going to put a paragraph at the top of this, you heard the story. And the paragraph he wrote was, anyone with an, I'm paraphrasing, because it's classified, I can't reproduce it. But yet it's been published in the New York Times, but don't get me started. He more or less said, anyone with an interest in Darfur should read this cable. It's written by Ron Capps. He's sort of our local expert. And my favorite line is the one where he says, I don't necessarily agree with his conclusions, which is classic Foreign Service speaking.
Yeah.
I don't necessarily agree, I don't necessarily disagree with his conclusions. But I want to put these ideas out there. And so, the cable somehow ended up in the hands of Nicholas Kristof. I don't know how it got there. He got it from Eric somebody. This guy teaches up at one of the Seven Sisters colleges up in New Hampshire, right? Is there a college? There are colleges. Teaches up in New England. Teaches English literature, but spends almost all his time writing about Darfur. He got a copy of the cable from someone. He published it, gave it to Kristof. It was in the New York Times. After I got the Rivkin Award, NPR was publishing part of it. You know, so it was kind of everywhere. You know, I gave my notes for the cable because they're just working notes to a woman who wrote a book, and so it's been republished. You know what the National Security Archives are?
Yes.
It's in. The draft is over there. So I mean, if you wanted to read it, it's there. But it's classified, so I can't talk about it.
thank you.
But you've all been very patient. Thank you very much.